According to Solicitor General Elena Kagan, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia is the justice who has had the most important impact over the years on how we think and talk about law. This week's guest has written the first full-scale biography of the influential justice. The Kirkus Review says that the book she's produced is every bit as provocative and entertaining as the man himself. This week on Dialogue, American Original. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest today is Joan Biskupic. Joan is the legal affairs correspondent for USA Today. She's covered the Supreme Court for 20 years, having previously covered the highest court in the land for the Washington Post. She's also the author of a book about Sandra Day O'Connor and has now completed this new work, American Original: The Life and Constitution of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Joan, welcome back and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
Before we get into the life and times of Antonin Scalia, I want to just ask you about the process of writing the book. And the first question of why you decided to delve into this book after you've already taken on the task of chronicling the life of a previous Supreme Court justice.
Right, and they're so different. Sandra Day O'Connor is so different from Justice Scalia. And in fact, in the O'Connor book, which came out, as you know, about 4 years ago, there was a chapter entitled Scalia versus O'Connor, because they had such different approaches to the law and different personalities. And at the time, I never thought I would take him on as a subject. But because of sort of looking at where she was and her polar opposite, and thinking about, frankly, the man who appointed both of them, President Reagan, I thought he was such an embodiment of what President Reagan was trying to do with the counter-revolution. She wasn't, of course. She was chosen as being the first woman justice, conservative, of course, at that time. But he really embodied what President Reagan was trying to do with the courts. And I thought he would be a good subject. And as you know, you start down these paths and you think, will I really stay engaged with my subject? Do I really want to devote all my evenings and weekends to it? But the more I looked at Justice Scalia, the more I thought, yes, there's a very fascinating story here that many people don't know.
He is a fascinating, larger-than-life type character. Yeah. Speaking of your subject, how cooperative was he in the process of writing the book?
Oh, well, that's a good question, because in the beginning he was not. He said to me, look, I'm not going to stand in the way of you talking to some of my colleagues, to my family, to former law clerks, but I don't want to sit for any interviews because I don't want it to look authorized. And I said, listen, just keep an open mind. Nobody is going to think you authorized this book. I'm doing it as an independent journalist. Just keep an open mind. Well, in the end, I ended up with about a dozen on-the-record interviews. And it was because I kept coming back to him saying, look what I found, look what I know, look at what you don't know about your family. And it was the case. I delved into lots of immigration records up in New Jersey, where he was born and spent his early years. And I think he wanted to find out information from me as much as I really wanted to find
the work of finding the family tree information for him.
Yeah.
Was there ever a moment where you told him something like that, where he was very grateful because it was something he liked knowing and didn't previously know?
I ran into him at a social occasion, and I had just come back from another trip to Trenton, where he was born, and I mentioned a few of the things I discovered. So he started calling me and asking me about, what about my father at this point? What about my father at that point? His father came here as a young teenager from Sicily, knowing very little English, and went on to get a PhD in Romance languages at Columbia. His father was quite the inspiration to him professionally, but also in part a little bit of a mystery to him. The father was could be very stern, a very demanding driver in the family, and I found that the relationship between son and father was quite critical to his own personality.
That part of the story almost reads like something from Hollywood Central Casting, the quintessential immigrant tale.
Yes.
The Ellis Island experience,
yes.
the struggle in New York in that very vibrant time.
It was, and in fact, Justice Scalia was an only child of two very striving...
Now having 9 himself.
That's right. Two very striving Italian-American families. And he did go on to have 9 children. But what a lot of people didn't know, and I didn't know, was that not only was he an only child, he was the only offspring of his generation from these 2 families. His mother came from a family of 7. No one else had a child. His father was one of 2. The sister didn't have a child. So can you imagine the sort of both attention that he got as a child child, a lot of attention as a child,
Well,
but also the burden on him.
Yeah, expectations. He was the guy who was going to carry on the legacy.
That's right.
But I think you correct me. I can't remember it, but I think you said he was an education project for his parents.
Oh, that's what Justice Scalia's own son Eugene, who happens to be the eldest boy in that family, said that his parents, Eugene's grandparents, made the justice essentially an education project. And the father, as I said, ended up being quite educated in the end, getting his PhD, teaching himself as a professor for about 3 decades at Brooklyn College, Romance languages. And his mother, even though she didn't go on to college herself, was always known among her little grade school chums and then in the family as a very studious young woman. And they, again, an only child in a first-generation Italian immigrant family, a lot of pressure there.
One of the small surprises for me was the fact that he never learned to speak Italian.
Yes, and he said that he felt he'd let his father down with that. It's probably a lot going on in the household in terms of identifications as an Italian. He certainly felt some discrimination as an Italian back in those days. He was born in 1936. You're thinking of the 30s, 40s, 50s. Italians are still, as a group, fairly new to America. And for one reason or another, he didn't learn Italian. And the justice told me that he felt he let his father down in that regard.
We'll bounce around. We won't be completely linear. I want to go back to the sausage making for who are the other sources of interviews that were most useful to you?
Oh, the justices themselves, his colleagues. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as you probably know, is his best friend at the Supreme Court. And they, go to operas together. They travel internationally together. They've known each other since the 70s. And she, of course, is a liberal jurist. She's a feminist on the law. She is very different from my subject. And she said, sometimes I'd like to strangle him, but I love him. Justice John Paul Stevens, another liberal, the most senior member of the bench right now, was a terrific source for me. And he said, sometimes I think what Nino, as he's called, does can be counterproductive to what he wants, but he's been very influential in terms of being counterproductive. He was talking about Scalia's way with rhetoric that can often turn off people at the court. But he said, he's been influential. Some of it has been constructive. Some of it has not. This is Justice Stevens, who is really the opposite on the law now on the bench, because he, for example, in Bush v. Gore, he led the dissent against what Justice Scalia was able to do with that Florida election decision that essentially gave George W. Bush the White House.
The nickname Nino,
yes.
Where did it come from, and who gets to call him that?
Well, actually, everyone, I don't, of course, I call him Justice Scalia, but everybody else does. I mean, he's been known, among all his chums, his professional colleagues, as Nino all his life, really, all his life in Washington.
His childhood nickname.
Yes, and in fact, he, Antonino was his grandfather, and then he was Antonin, minus the O at the end. So he's always gone by that. And in fact, he said, one or two stories from his time in the Nixon and Ford administration, when someone came up to him and tried to familiarly approach him and call him Tony, he immediately knew this was a fraud, because he never went by Tony.
No one never called him Tony.
No, right.
Back to those formative years, one of the phrases you use in describing his household, first of all, within the book, it's clear that he's a man who's comfortable with tension and conflict,
yes.
even revels in it, perhaps.
Yes.
You said his household was small and intense.
It was, and I talk about the conflict in that household because his father, as I said, was quite an intellectual, always had his nose in the books, didn't abide silliness. This was the father's side. The mother's side, these 7 children were quite fun-loving. They were in sales, they were in politics, they were practical jokers. The patriarch in that family was a great storyteller. He actually, as one of his own children, and aunt to Justice Scalia told me he was the first one on New Year's Eve to be banging the pots and pans and proclaiming, Happy New Year to everyone. He actually ran off with another woman. So that family was quite colorful, that side, his mother's side. Whereas the father's side was quite upright and reserved. And that created some tension among these two families in this, tight row house in Trenton, New Jersey. And I think the justice from an early age came to exist very well in conflict, and as I say in the book, readily generated it himself.
Yeah, that duality you describe seems to be his father and mother live both in him. Is that
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes.
You also, fast forwarding to, I think this was a speech when graduating from his undergrad degree, smart, confident, righteous, or perhaps his graduate degree. You said that he was smart, confident, and righteous and had an air of superiority.
This was at Georgetown. He graduated from Georgetown University here in Washington and then went on to get a Harvard Law degree. And there was a sense of that speech that you're referring to certainly embodies a sense of superiority, a sense of that we are the nation's leaders. We are also students who, because of our Catholic Jesuit training, have a certain plus. And of course, he was only 17, 18 years old at the time, but still something that I think has remained with him, a certain tone.
And a classic overachiever, first in his class in high school, first in his class in undergrad. This has been his slot in life from an early age.
Well, but he had some disappointments, and I think those setbacks drove him in some way. He didn't.
What was the first you think
Well,
of
the
that
first,
was significant?
he didn't get into the Catholic prep school that he wanted. He wanted to go to Regis. For your viewers who know the Catholic, especially Jesuit prep school world, he wanted to go to Regis up in New York. He flunked the entrance exam. And I thought, here's this kid who's so smart, so brainy, how could he flunk it? And he actually remembered one of the questions he got wrong, which is very revealing, I believe. And so he goes to Xavier, which is a fine prep school,
too. Not a bad plan B.
No. And wait to hear the other plan Bs. But it's interesting that he had that setback. And then he wanted to go to Princeton. He was born in New Jersey, grew up in Queens. Most of his life he spent in Queens, and very much is partial to he considers himself a New Yorker rather than someone from Trenton. And
that's an old story.
Yeah.
He's not the only one.
Right. He had gotten one of those very prestigious U.S. Naval scholarships, and he wanted to use it at Princeton, but he didn't get into Princeton. And he said, maybe they just didn't want an Italian boy from Queens. Again, his plan B was no slouch. It was Georgetown University. So those two things, I think, certainly made him want to prove himself. But then the one that I really used in the book as a turning point, especially politically, was when he wanted to become U.S. Solicitor General for the first Reagan term. Okay, we're back in 1981. We've had this huge revolution in politics and what Reagan wanted to do with the law. Antonin Scalia is at the time University of Chicago law professor, and he really does articulate in a lot of ways the Reagan judicial agenda. Right. And he wanted to be the Solicitor General, which, as you know, John, is the government's top lawyer before the court. And he felt that he was really equipped for this. In fact, it's ironic that you opened with something from Elena Kagan, who currently is the Solicitor General. And he interviewed with Attorney General William French Smith. He thought the interview had gone well, and he didn't get it. And to this day, he says he remains bitterly disappointed.
But does that work in his favor? Because then the Federal Society is something he becomes a faculty advisor.
That's
in
right.
The early years.
That's right.
Might not have happened had he gotten that
Well,
job.
and the other thing that might not have happened, when you're the Solicitor General, you do have to take some tough positions. And the last U.S. Solicitor General that became a justice was Thurgood Marshall back in the 60s. These people often will have to watch it more often than not. But he ended up on the District of Columbia Appeals Court here, the U.S. Circuit, and it was a much better job for him, and he essentially didn't make any wrong moves that would have excluded him for consideration for the U.S. Supreme Court in 1986.
I think one of the things you do a really good job of in the book, among other things, is that you give us some insight into what makes this man tick without going overboard and playing a psychologist without a degree. You let others draw those conclusions, but there's some fascinating things that are very revealing. You talk about him not changing with the times, and an example you use is not letting his kids wear jeans when that was becoming common.
Yeah, he was pretty tough with those children, as was his wife Maureen. He met his wife Maureen at Radcliffe. She was a Radcliffe student when he was in law school at Harvard, and they were a good match. They were both quite lucky in that, he especially. She went on to really raise those 9 children for him.
He gives her credit for that.
Yes, very much. But know, they have a lot of strict rules. They actually also are pretty conservative Catholics, as he says. Vatican II was not on his hit parade. So you know, they kept a real clamp on the kids in those early years.
You talk about the lessons he learned during his time with the Nixon and Ford administrations.
Yeah.
Could you give us a brief summary
Yes.
of what some of those
Yes.
most important lessons
Yes.
were?
Well, you know, it's interesting. His elevation came just as Watergate was crumbling. It was, you know, taking so many people down. As some of his former colleagues from that era said, you know, so many of the Republicans were trying to get out of the Nixon White House because, you know, this is 1974. Exactly. It was a sinking ship. People were worried about being tainted. And he was a real striver and wanted to move up. And that's when President Nixon nominated him to be an assistant attorney general to head the Office of Legal Counsel, a very prestigious, brainy part of the Justice Department. His nomination is pending when Watergate comes to a climax in August of 1974. Gerald Ford continues with the Scalia nomination, and he becomes the Assistant Attorney General. His very first assignment, it's the office that determines sort of constitutional rules for the White House. His very first assignment was who owns the Nixon Watergate tapes and other materials that Nixon wanted to take with him to California after he resigned, and Congress and many others, you know, wanted to make sure were kept in the public domain. Antonin Scalia writes an opinion that was supported by just about everybody else in the White House at the time that Nixon owned the papers. Congress essentially reverses that by making them public documents.
I want to move ahead. We have so much time to cover. We're running out of time, and I want to cover so many more things. But let's move forward to when he's appointed to be a member of the Supreme Court. And during the hearings, Senator Kennedy at the time is pressing him on Roe v. Wade. Tell us about that exchange.
And he says he is, you know, whatever his personal opinion is, it would not influence him. He says he essentially won't answer questions on Roe v. Wade. And he doesn't answer many substantive questions at all. In fact, Arlen Specter, the senator from Pennsylvania, later writes that he hardly would give his name, rank, and serial number. He was expert at
Does this now set the playbook for these types of nomination hearings?
No, I think what happened with his is that it came just a week or two after William Rehnquist's nomination hearing to be elevated.
So the Senate was out of steam.
The Senate was, and especially those liberal Democrats. They had spent so much time trying to fight the elevation of William Rehnquist from Associate Justice to Chief Justice because he had a very solid record of conservatism and other things that many Democrats opposed, that by the time they got to Nino Scalia, the first Italian-American to be nominated, a man without an obvious record, although the point I make is that it was hiding in plain sight, and a man who a lot of them knew socially. Howard Metzenbaum, the Democrat from Ohio, who was quite liberal, opens by talking about having just played squash with the nominee. There was a real good old boy feel to those hearings.
Is that typical that a Supreme Court nominee is so well-wired politically?
It was in the olden days, that's for sure, and it has been since, but it's usually not made that big a deal of. I mean, certainly Robert Bork knew a lot of these people, but it didn't help him, and he wasn't playing poker with the Democrats the way Justice Scalia was.
He said he had no agenda in
Yes.
that exchange with Senator Kennedy.
Yes.
Look, they all will say that, and most of them probably believe that. Do you think that's a fair description of how he's conducted himself as a justice?
I think that's a key question because I think he actually believes he has no agenda, but he certainly votes in a particular way. He certainly votes in a particular ideological manner. And I think that for him to say that he probably didn't think he was lying. He probably thought that, you know, look, I'm going to interpret the law the way I see it. And as critics in the book say, well, it's interesting how the law seems to always line up the way where his ideological interests are.
And he's confirmed 98-0.
Yes.
No controversy on the vote.
No,
Joe
Biden has that great line about how, you know, if you were like Bill Rehnquist, I wouldn't be voting for you, but I know you don't have an agenda. But as you probably know, John, Senator, now Vice President Joe Biden has said, boy, if I had any vote that I could take back, I'd take back the one for Justice Scalia. And not just because he felt like he didn't see the man for what he was, but he says he's been so darn effective.
Yeah, because of his effectiveness.
Yeah.
Let's talk about his initial days on the highest court.
Right.
We already sort of previewed that when you talked about his relationship with Sandra Day O'Connor. But what was it like for him, this blustery, larger-than-life guy, being the junior member of the club?
Well, he didn't like to compromise. He felt that, you know, look, I have my ideas of where the law should be, and I'm not going to start trading the way, for example, Justice Bill Brennan, who was so effective at putting together a 5-justice coalition, did. And he turned off some of his colleagues with his manner, mostly the liberal justices, but Harry Blackmun, somebody who might be more in the middle, and Sandra Day O'Connor. But then he figured out how to really take his message beyond the marble walls. And that when I started this book, that was where he had been most effective. These battle cries to conservatives that he was issuing in dissents, only since the George W. Bush appointments of Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Samuel Alito has Justice Scalia had more votes for what he wants, not just the paper to write the dissents on.
It sure sounds a lot like judicial activism, which seems to be something you call a decision that you don't agree with. I mean, this is most people, when they look at the Supreme Court, view people who are detached out there, no TV cameras in their robes, very austere. You're describing a very effective political operative.
Well, and the way he would counter it, and as you know from this book, I let both sides have their say, right. And obviously people draw certain conclusions. He says, hey, I'm a textualist. I'm an originalist. I look only back on the words of the Constitution. How can I let my own personal opinion come in if I'm just reading the text? And what Justice Stephen Breyer says to him is, don't kid yourself, pal. Everybody brings in their own personal experiences, their viewpoints, their ideology. Some of us are just more honest than others.
Well, here's something that some people on the right have said. He was attacked for seeing what he wanted to see in the Constitution and not what was necessarily there. I think, was that in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore?
Well, in Bush v. Gore, he actually got some criticism from conservatives, although conservatives certainly liked the political outcome.
Well, they liked the outcome.
But they felt that the court as a whole, the majority, I should say, not as a whole, because it was a very split decision, 5-4, was breathing more life into the Equal Protection Clause than was really there, and that in some ways Justice Scalia and the others could not fully defend it as an originalist matter. But as I said, I think that the criticism was more at a minimum there because of the outcome.
Of all of the decisions that he's been a part of, whether in the majority or the minority, what would be an example of something that suggests that he does have an agenda, perhaps, or that his originalism is not as pure as he would like to think it is?
Well, actually, I'll take that question as what would be a quintessential Scalia decision, and I'd say, something like the dissent he wrote in Romer v. Evans. That's the 1996 gay rights case from Colorado, where he really goes further than just talking about the law, and he talks about morals, and he talks about exactly what the majority is doing in terms of signaling something positive on gay rights, when that's not the business of the court to signal anything positive on gay rights. And it's a very harsh dissent. It's a very loud dissent, and man, did it get attention. In fact, in many ways, it was commented on much more, again, as a dissenting opinion, than the majority opinion that Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, again, in this gay rights vein.
And he's been characterized as a homophobe by Barney Frank.
Yes, he won't comment on that, but yes,
well,
right.
I can see why he wouldn't. But what about, are there any surprising decisions in his track record of jurisprudence?
Well, this man has been very consistent. My first subject, Sandra Day O'Connor, changed a lot over the years. Certainly moved much more to the left, became more open to different viewpoints, certainly redefined her own jurisprudence in some ways. Justice Scalia was the same at Harvard, actually was the same at Georgetown, was the same at Harvard, was the same in the Nixon and Ford administrations. And I would say that his rulings have always had a very consistent theme. I've never really been surprised at what he's done. He will say to others, well, look, what I voted to uphold flag burning as a First Amendment matter. That and I don't like, this is his phrasing, I don't like scruffy bearded
guys who
wear sandals and want to burn the flag, but see, I'll do something different because than what you might expect of me because of my originalist point of view. But frankly, there aren't any real big surprises.
Yeah, that consistency probably speaks to the effectiveness Joe Biden has sort of admired.
Well, and that's it. I think a lot of law students out there don't like what Justice O'Connor or Justice Anthony Kennedy stand for in terms of kind of carving out the middle, staking out the middle. They like, even if they don't like Scalia's politics or his ideology, they sort of like that firm, confident, stubborn even approach, and that has gotten a lot of attention. I have known that he has opened up case books that law students use to see, are his dissents in there? You know, he likes that he gets his message out.
Yeah. Did he want to be Chief Justice?
I think he did. I think he said to me, look, I was 69 years old at the time. How could I ever have been Chief Justice? I would have even told them, don't name me Chief Justice. But hey, these are ambitious people.
Yeah.
These are people who want to move up. And, you know, he had known John Roberts, and John Roberts certainly had practiced a lot before the court. John Roberts was, you know,
heavily influenced by.
Well, and exactly, yes, John Roberts was very much influenced as a young man by Justice Scalia. But face it, you know, he came on. He's right now the Chief Justice is 54. Antonin Scalia is 73. The math was not in his favor, and also, boy, would that have been a confirmation fight.
Talk about his role in the current court and even the relationship with Chief Justice Roberts.
Well, you know, it's interesting. He is starting to get more majority opinions. He's in some ways working better with this group in terms of building consensus and keeping a majority. But again, as I said before, John, he's got a whole new crowd of players, in part because they are, largely because they are much more conservative than who he was working with before. I think that there's a certain level of respect, although there's some wariness between the Chief Justice and Justice Scalia. But just think of what he was able to pull off in the D.C. guns case. That's the Second Amendment case where the court for the first time said that there's an individual right to bear arms. Prior to that, there was always an understanding that
militia
there was
regulated.
It was a state, you know, a state militia right. And Justice Scalia was assigned that opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts, and he kept all 5 together for the majority, which was a major feat. And that's how I end the book, saying, look, this man has now sort of transcended his prior role as this very loud dissenter issuing battle cries to someone who can pull together a majority.
So the conclusion being that this might be his moment. This is where his power is at its zenith.
That's right. He has arrived at his apex. And when I said to him, gee, you are writing more majority opinions, you're having more influence, he said, the winds, damn few. So he wants more.
A final thought, Joan, about
Sure.
placing him in his historical context. In all of the people, men and women who've served on the highest court in the land, where does he fall?
It remains to be seen, of course, John, but I think that in terms of his jurisprudence, he still is not going to be as effective because he is at the extreme. Face it. You know, he's
even
not,
within his own conservative.
Yes, right. When you think of
genre.
the conservative majority, he and Clarence Thomas, a fellow originalist, are still so far to the right that they don't embody what lower courts will accept, what the American people will accept over time. So I think that he has articulated a viewpoint that is being picked up by various conservative acolytes out there, but I don't think that it will become a prevailing point of view.
Is you know, I hadn't thought of it like this until I just heard this answer from you, but is this revolution that he represents, the Reagan Revolution in some ways that he represents, is he one of the last men standing to really hold it all together?
Well, in terms of the judiciary, yes, because look at this, John. Democrats now control the White House, Democrats control the Congress, but the third branch is still firmly rooted in conservatism at this point, and one of its main leaders, Antonin Scalia.
Has he read the book and told you what he thinks?
He's gone through it, and when he's done, we'll probably talk.
Congratulations. Terrific book. Good luck on the rest of the book tour.
Thanks a lot.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for this discussion. In addition to thanking Joan and wishing her best of luck with the book, we want to thank you for listening and watching and appreciate your comments. So we encourage you to send them to us, and you can do so with an email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, on behalf of the Dialogue production team and all the staff at the Woodrow Wilson Center, thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.